Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host, Simon. I'm here, one of my writers, in this case, Emma. Thank you, Emma, has written me a script, The Bain Family Murders. If you're new here, I've never read this before. The format of the show is that we're going to read it together and discover all about these Bain Family Murders, which I've never heard of. Or maybe I have. Bane's a very generic name, so let's get sorry to all the Banes out there. Let's get into it. Legal disclaimer. Dangerous place to start. In this script, we will speculate as the possible liability for criminal acts of people related to the victims. At no point do we claim any specialist knowledge, nor to know for certain who committed those crimes, and all statements made should be taken as statements of opinion. Yes, absolutely. These are always just my opinions, allegedly. The Bain Family Murders is known as the most widely discussed and divisive in New Zealand's criminal history. Okay, I guess if I was from New Zealand, then I'd have heard of this. And the case surrounding their deaths was reviewed by legal experts from the UK, Canada, and Australia, all of whom came to different conclusions. So join us as we take a deep dive into the facts surrounding the case and try and figure out for ourselves who the most likely murderer was. Oh, I do love a good murder mystery. Except this is real life and people actually got murdered, which makes it kind of like a bit more grim, doesn't it? But that's what we're here for. You're listening or watching a true crime show. Grim is what you're all about, you dark soul, you. The Bain family. Robin Irvin Bane was born on the 25th of November 1935 in Stratford, Taranaki, New Zealand. He was the eldest of 4 children and grew up in a Christian household. The entire family took part in various church activities, and according to his brother Michael, Robin used to sing in the church choir and played guitar. After finishing high school, Robin started working as a teacher and would eventually earn his degree in teaching at the University of Otago. I really like the name Robin. My wife and I, we thought if we had a third kid, which we did debate for a while, and then ultimately decided no, 2 is enough, that we'd call them Robin, whether they were a girl or a boy. This is such a nice name. In 1964, the 28-year-old Robin joined a volunteer scheme at his local church and accepted a teaching position at a remote village school in Papua New Guinea. Holy shit, that's like an adventure and a half. Where he reportedly fell in love with the simple life led by the people he met while living there. He lived in Papua New Guinea for 2 years before he moved to Dunedin in New Zealand. And in 1968, the 33-year-old Robin met the 25-year-old archaeology student named Margaret Cullen. He's like, got some news. If we're to get married, you've got to move back and enjoy the simple life with me on Papua New Guinea. I don't know much about Papua New Guinea in like the 1960s or whatever, but I don't know much about Papua New Guinea today. But I imagine it's like quite different from New Zealand. Margaret Arawa Cullen was born on the 11th of October 1943 and was also one of 4 siblings. She'd also been raised in a very religious family and continued to take part in church activities when she moved to Dunedin to attend university, which is how she met Robin. According to her brother-in-law, Michael Bane, Margaret was bright, happy, intelligent, and great company. She had wide interests, was knowledgeable, and enjoyed a good-humoured argument, always finishing with a good laugh. She was also an excellent pianist and shared Robin's interest in music. They were well-suited and very happy. She sounds nice. I like these people who can have, like, arguments, like debates at dinner, and then just laugh it off and be like, yeah, it's fun, isn't it? It's fun. We're not like actually angry at each other. We've just got different opinions and it's nice to discuss them. I like people like this. They were married in August 1969 and bought a house at 65 Every Street in Andersons Bay, Dunedin. Their eldest son, David Cullen Bane, was born on the 28th of March 1972, and when David was 2 years old, their family got the opportunity to move back to Papua New Guinea. Okay, I was kind of joking, but they did move back to Papua New Guinea. Robin had accepted a position as a deputy principal at Gowlim Teaching Training College, and according to the principal at the time, Robin, quote, carried out his duties with a characteristic sense of humour and quiet authority. He provided sound professional leadership and gained the respect of the staff. He showed a real strength in his ability to stimulate thinking and creativity, amongst others. The family welcomed 3 more children while they were living in Papua New Guinea. Arawa Mary Bane, who was born on the 26th of June 1974, Laniet Margaret Bane, who was born on the 19th of March 1976, and Stephen Robert Bane, who was born on the 1st of January 1980. Margaret became fascinated by the local culture and reportedly fully immersed herself in it, learning as much about the local customs and beliefs as she could. She had reportedly been homeschooling her children, but as she became more involved with life on the islands, she allegedly started neglecting her family. Their neighbours at the time would report that the family were odd, with some of the reports describing them as hippies. They do sound like, they do sound like hippies, don't they? When is this? Oh, it's the 1980s, so you're a little bit late for being hippie. But people, there's still hippies. Like, sometimes I'm walking down the street, I see some dude, he's got like massive dreads, he's wearing like hemp. And it's like, dude, this dude was made for the 60s, but he's just too late. Their neighbours would explain that when the Bain children were little, they would often run around dirty, naked, and unsupervised. They also complained that Margaret wasn't keeping up with their schooling and that she no longer cared about keeping a clean and orderly home. But Margaret and Robin argued that they saw no harm in letting their kids grow up away from the evil influences of the modern world. I imagine these people, it's like, you do you, man. Peace, bro. And then social services be like, you do you, but you have to educate your children and they can't be dirty. Come on. It's like, man, peace and love, man. It's like, yes, but come on. You got a job to do. But Margaret soon became increasingly more extreme in her religious beliefs. She had started mixing Christianity with the superstitions of the local tribes and reportedly became fascinated with the practices of traditional healers on the island, and in particular, the amount of influence these matriarchs had over their communities. That's a bit of a weird sign, isn't it? Where it's like, why are you interested in traditional healing? No, not for the healing. That's obviously nonsense. I'm just interested in how these people manipulate their flock. It's getting a little bit culty, isn't it? This led to her believing in things like reincarnation, channeling, or the ability to commune with spirits, ancestors, or some other higher power, and dream interpretation, which her Western neighbours referred to as her New Age beliefs. I had a vivid-ass dream the other night. I have no idea what it was about. At the risk, this is one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, tell me about your dreams, Simon. I'm fascinated by your dreams, because you're like, wow, my dreams are so interesting. And then you tell them out loud and you're like, wow, that's boring. Dude, the only reason it was interesting is because you were there. Can you shut the f*** up? I had a dream that I could talk to peacocks and they were very wise. That's it. That was the most vivid dream I've had in a long time, but I could talk to peacocks. I don't know why. She would perform rituals to cleanse their vehicle and home from evil spirits, and reportedly carried an amulet around her neck that she would use to make decisions. Wait, vehicle. It's like, okay, you let your kids run around naked, it's all peace and love. It's like, no, eschew the modern world. Except for my Toyota, I need that Toyota. She would swing it like a pendulum and then interpret the movements to decide everyday things like which groceries she should buy that day, or whether she should just spend all day in bed. Robin, on the other hand, spent most of his time at school, and he was involved in a lot of charity work. He was also a member of several bluegrass bands, because of course he was, and the children all took part in several local plays and productions. They regularly went camping and backpacking, travelled extensively around the islands, and spent entire days at the beach, during which Robin became a qualified scuba diver. Because this is the most stereotypical hippie shit that I've ever heard. Their lives were seemingly idyllic, and the children loved living on the islands. But as time went on, Margaret became worried that there was something fundamentally wrong with her family. In 1987, she contacted a psychologist and educational training consultant called Dr. Davina Pockroy and told her about her concerns. Dr. Pockroy agreed to see what could be done to help the Bain family. Wait, other than being a bunch of hippies, what's wrong with the Bain family? When she entered the home, though, Dr. Pockroy was disgusted by the state of the house, and later several people would confirm that Margaret and Robin were some of the worst kind of hoarders. Oh dear. I've never seen so much chaos. Everything was mixed up. Old food, dirty underpants, fat dripping down the kitchen walls. Oh, guys, that's grim. Get an extractor fan, my dudes. Worse still was the state of the family's dynamics, and Dr. Pockroy would later explain that the relationships that Margaret had with her family were incredibly toxic. Okay, we've got a lengthy quote from the good doctor here. Margaret was very overweight and desperate to restart her sex life with Robin. Whenever she spoke, she had multiple motives. She put Robin down and was worried that the children were beginning to have their own thoughts about things. Don't want to have those kids having thoughts, do you, Margaret? They would no longer accept her control and ideas. She didn't really listen, just talked non-stop, a continuous stream of words. It was like watching a video of a pathological dysfunction at a level I'd never experienced. Margaret was a dangerous person who wanted to get inside their minds and control everything that everybody did all the time. The 13-year-old Arawa seemed so relieved to be able to talk and express herself. She just wanted to go to school and be normal. And 15-year-old David, as the eldest, might have borne the brunt of his mother's madness. When I talked to David, he was cooperative but guarded with what he said. He was the only one who talked about his father with respect and caring. He had a good relationship with his father. Robin I talked to later. He was cooperative. He didn't say anything that would rock the boat. He was interested in solving any problem with the kids. I perceived that his whole role within the family was an act. He was like a shell, no emotion. Margaret dominated him. Always. Margaret sounds mean. She started off being like this harmless hippie woman who I like. She was like, oh yeah, no, have a good debate and a laugh about it. And now she's like, God forbid my children have unique thoughts. I should decide their thinking. Chill, Margaret. Chill. Dr. Pockroy was shaken by what she'd seen and concluded that the entire family should seek the help of a team of counselors and therapists and never went to visit the family again. Oh my God. Dr. Pockroy is like, you're up and way beyond my pay grade. You need a team of me. A year later, the family returned to Dunedin and moved back into the home at 65 Every Street in Anderson's Bay, Dunedin. David was 16, Arawa 14, Laniet 12, and Stephen was 8. And according to some reports, they had trouble adjusting to their new lives. They'd never gone to a traditional school, they could barely read or write, and they longed to go back to Papua New Guinea. But they all signed up for theatre and music clubs, and soon all 4 of the Bain children made friends and started settling into their new lives. For the first 2 years, Robin worked several temporary jobs before finally accepting a position as the principal of the small Thai Airy Beach School in August 1990. There, he introduced the students to the world of computers, a move that was considered to be revolutionary and resulted in the school being featured in local newspapers after the students had sent out an email to several international schools which read, "Hey world, here we are." According to his brother Michael, Robin wanted to provide an opportunity for children to be creative and develop their own interests. He saw the need for each child to be computer literate and to be able to use information technology. He also believed in the dignity of the individual and had an understanding and sympathetic approach to special needs children. He believed in the importance of distinguishing between unacceptable activity and an unacceptable person, and that the best person to deal with the problem was the person who owns the problem. He believed integrity is the most important quality a teacher can aspire to. The quote ends. Though Robin was loved, admired, and respected by his pupils, the same couldn't be said for his family. The house at 65 Every Street was in shambles, and Robin and Margaret started planning on tearing it down and replacing it with a more modern home. Their marriage wasn't faring much better. Richard Matches, an old friend of Robin and Margaret's, would later say that Margaret was an extrovert, often loud, and sometimes inappropriate in her speech and behaviour. He got the impression that Margaret was the dominant person in the relationship. Well, I wonder what gave you that impression, mate? And explained that she liked to belittle Robin in front of others. Once, when he asked Margaret how she and Robin were doing, she told him that, terrible, if I could shoot him, I would. Oh, Margaret! You admitted to your future crimes? Allegedly. Shortly after they moved to Dunedin, Margaret had started to refer to women as Belial, aka the devil, and continued to dominate the household, consistently preaching to her children that their father was full of the devil. She went so far as to perform cleansing rituals whenever he left the room so that she could clear the house of his influence, and often raged that her teenage kids were just as bad as he was. Margaret, you seem a little bit off your rocker, to be honest. And by a little, I mean a lot. At one point, Margaret moved out of the house and into an old caravan that stood in the backyard to escape Robin's evil influences. She obsessively wrote in her diary, Nah, if you're potentially getting up to crimes, don't keep a diary. Unless that diary is, explicitly designed to throw people off the scent. In early 1990, she wrote, quote, over the week, I've come to realize that this caravan is my temple to God, sacred grounds, that there is no place for me inside where it is not clear. I was terribly upset all day as I realized what I'd given up, spent all day meditating and crying, just never seemed to stop. Robin came, but not clear, and obviously had to be bawled at over and over. Obviously. He needed a good shouting, and obviously I had to deliver it. Oh, Margaret, what are you smoking? Talk to David about his feelings with me out here. He saw how he was centered on self, but revealed confusion and worry for family. The only real inadequacy I have is not catering for my needs. Another quiet, gentle day, looking after me. Oh, you self-centered person. You got children. Come on now. Come on. It's like I'm a pretty self-centered person, but it's like, yo, when you got kids, you gotta pretend not to be. But once winter came around, Margaret decided that she could no longer live in the isolated, freezing caravan, so she kicked Robin out of the house and he had to move into the caravan instead. Shortly after, Robin would accept the job at the Thai Airy Beach School and he'd stay at the school during the week and only went back home to Every Street on the weekends and Monday nights. Initially, he'd sleep in the back of his van, but later he moved into the old schoolhouse. His marriage to Margaret was basically over, but he still wanted to spend time with his kids, and since they depended on his income, neither he nor Margaret applied for a divorce. Whenever Robin spent time at 65 Every Street, he'd get up at 6:30 a.m, head inside to use the bathroom, pray, use the computer, and have meals with the family. At night, he'd watch TV with Margaret and the kids before heading back to the caravan where he'd read a book or listen to the radio. He still took part in community events like the annual Polar Plunge, sang in the church choir with David, and regularly attended his children's theatrical performances. But Robin told his brother Michael Bain that he dreaded going back to 65 Every Street every weekend because he felt rejected by his family. I always am a bit nervous about calling people out so early in the episode, because then it's they could turn out to be a right monster, and it turns out that he was the devil. But it's Robin seems like a good dude. I like Robin. Changed my mind. Margaret, I liked you at first, but you seem like a right meanie. Going with Robert now. Robert's my dude. Sorry, Robin. Meanwhile, Margaret became more and more obsessed with the idea that her family was possessed by the devil. In March 1990, she wrote in her diary that she'd called for a family meeting to help her family rid themselves of the devil, but explained that her family members lacked the motivation to rid themselves of Robin's influences. Paul Morris, the then head of literature studies at Victoria University, would later explain that according to Margaret, Robin was failing to do all sorts of things he should be doing. My feeling was that they were deeply estranged. Wonder what gave you that feeling, the fact that he's living at fucking school. There's a kind of distance feel about the way she wrote about them. Lots of negativity. What you get is a sort of toxic family environment. Seeing the devil being active on an almost daily basis in your own household can't be conducive to family life. She was concerned for all the kids. She was estranged from the family to the extent of seeing an utterly alien force there. I get the sense that she wasn't there for them. End quote. Margaret would spend all day in bed or off meditating on just how inherently evil her family was, and the children were left to manage the household. She'd give them each a list of chores that had to be done, and these chores would keep them busy for up to 8 hours a day. Don't they? Aren't they at school? Their dad's literally a teacher at a school. They did go to school though, right? So, wait, we just talked about how they integrated into school. Is this they spend 8 hours at school, then they get home, they do 8 hours of chores, and then they just sleep for 8 hours? This is a terrible life for a child. When she wasn't meditating about Robin's evil influence on her family, she made homemade preserves or worked on plans for their new house. She wanted to demolish the old house and replace it with a sanctuary where she and her children could live happily ever after. This sanctuary was to be a haven against evil influences, which of course meant that Robin wasn't going to be allowed to live in the house with the rest of the family. Her withdrawal from the family worried Robin, who told a friend of the family that Margaret was away with the fairies. It does sound, away with the fairies. I fucking love that way of saying someone's loopy. She's lost it. She's off her rocker and she needs medical help. The children, of course, all led lives outside of the house. David had grown up to be tall and lanky, and he had protruding ears. Some people referred to him as being geeky, weird, and morally uptight, and a woman named Caroline later explains that after she had agreed to go to the school dance with him, David started calling her every day, wanted to talk for hours on end, and came across as controlling. Probably super religious parents, isn't it? It got to the point where she told him that she wasn't interested in dating him and that he had to back off. Quoting, "With him, it was all or nothing. He just didn't have any idea on how to be somebody's friend. He either had to be all in and controlling everything, like where we went or what we did. He was talking to me all the time, and I wasn't allowed to talk to anyone else. It reminds me of your mother, David. I wonder where you got that influence from." After she confronted him, David backed off and never contacted Caroline again. He had other friends as well, and one of them explained that she grew to really like the geeky David, but thought that his home life was horrible. Yes, because it was. You basically have a checked out mother and a mother that's not allowing the father to really do his job. Because Margaret insisted that Robin had no role to play in the family, David saw himself as the new man of the house and often butted heads with Robin. He managed the household alongside Margaret and had helped to plan the sanctuary. David had gone to university after high school, but had dropped out after the first year and signed up for unemployment benefits. He started delivering newspapers in the mornings before helping out his mum with the preparations for the sanctuary, and would later get a job with Opera Alive, where he sang in the choir. Due to his new interest in music, David then signed up for a degree in classical music at the University of Otago and aspired to become a renowned opera singer. Dream, you follow your dreams, mate. Come on.
Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams.
Aurora, on the other hand, had lots of friends and was the head girl during her last year of high school. She would often invite friends over to her house, but they would later report that they didn't feel comfortable in the Bain house. A friend of hers named Kristen Kosh would later explain that Margaret would ignore Aurora for weeks on end and would just lie in bed and do nothing. Robin was kind but absent, and David would hang around them as if he were acting as a chaperone during their visits. Because of this, Aurora didn't invite many people over and preferred to meet up with her friends outside of school. But even then, David would accompany them so that he could keep an eye on his sister, and Aurora later opted to meet her friends in secret. Yes, what a surprise. David sounds like he's like little mummy, like weird. After school, she decided to follow in her parents' footsteps and took up studies at the Teachers' College, just like David Arawa took on part-time jobs and worked at a museum cafe and was saving up to eventually move into a flat of her own. Yes. If I was in this family situation and somehow I wasn't fucked up, like Arawa seems to have avoided through some miracle, I'd be like, I'm getting my money, I'm making that bag, and I'm getting my own house as soon as possible. You know, I don't have to live in a shoebox in someone else's house. Laniet was particularly troubled. According to Margaret, Laniet was just as full of the devil as Robin was, and whenever Margaret would go on a rant about how useless a husband he was, Laniet would jump to Robin's defense. Because of this, the two of them didn't get along, and Laniet left home at the age of 16, presumably after Margaret had kicked her out. Laniet would also work at the museum cafe and lived in a flat share, but after she left home, she started smoking cannabis and became a sex worker. During this time, she met and befriended a man named Dean Cottle, and it would later be alleged that he was her pimp. Cottle allegedly knew that Laniet's parents wouldn't approve of her new career and had allegedly blackmailed her for sex. When Robin moved into the schoolmaster's house at Tyeri Beach School, Laniet moved in with him to get away from Dean, but later told friends that she had asked David to convince Margaret to let her move back home, where she planned on making a fresh start. So I would not want to go back to the house. But I guess if that's your best option, that's your best option. The youngest member of the Bain family was Stephen. He had protruding ears like David's, but as soon as he hit puberty, all the signs were there that he was going to become a handsome young man. He had dark brown eyes, dark curly hair, was tall, had a strong jawline, was a happy, smiling kid, and according to his PE teacher, quote, he was full of life, and in physical education, he was a strong and very robust boy. He wasn't a sportsman in the sense that he had really good ball skills, but he was very, very tenacious and very physical. He wasn't afraid of physical contact. Stephen was quick-tempered as well, not in a really nasty sense, but I do recall twice having to break a little fracas up. Someone pushed his book off the desk and really wasn't apologetic about it, and he was up quick as a flash. He just stood his corner. He was a brave guy. Yeah, it sounds like completely reasonable. Someone's being a dick to him and he's like, yo, you want to continue doing that? You want to continue? You want to? I'll beat the shit out of you. It was in the week leading up to the murders that Laniet and Arawa would tell their friends that the whole family was getting together that weekend for a family meeting, and that it would be the first time in months that they would all be together again. That Monday morning, however, all but one member of the Bain family was dead. Oh no, I just assumed one of them was going to be killed, not the children. Oh no. The murders. At 7:09 a.m., on the morning of the 20th of June 1994, a call was made to the 111 emergency number. The voice on the telephone cried out, "No, they're all dead. They're all dead. I came home, and they're all dead." The person sounded distressed and out of breath, and when the operator asked who was dead, the person said, "My family. They're all dead. Hurry up." The operator calmly told the person, "It's all right," and then confirmed the address and telephone number before reassuring the person on the other side that the police were on their way. Constables Kim Stevenson and Jeff Wiley arrived at 65 Every Street at around 7:20 a.m. and because it was the middle of winter in the southern hemisphere, it was still dark out. An ambulance was already waiting at the scene, and the paramedics were hiding behind the ambulance waiting for the police to approach the front door just in case there was still an active shooter inside the house. The constables turned on their flashlights and made their way toward the front door, but when they saw a figure moving in front of the windows, the pair panicked and hid in their car until they were certain that whoever it was wasn't going to start shooting at them. A minute later, they were joined by Constable Les Andrew and Sergeant Murray Stapp, and once again, they made their way to the front door. They knocked, but didn't get an answer. So they decided to try and see if they could spot anyone inside the house. Junk had been piled up on the porch directly to their left, so Constable Wiley looked through a window on the right. Through a gap in the curtains, quote, "I could see a firearm on the floor, and I could see a hand." They managed to peer in through the other window and saw David Bane lying on the floor of the room in the fetal position, holding his head in his hands. Constable Wiley called to him. "I remember asking him to open the door, and he said no. I asked him, 'Where's your father?' He just pointed to the room across the hallway." David still didn't open the front door, so the police broke one of the window panes and unlocked the door from the outside. They stepped into a dark, cluttered hallway and found David in a bedroom to their left. Constable Stevenson went up to David and noticed that he was crying, saying, "They're all dead. They're all dead." Constable Stevenson asked David how many people were in the house, and David confirmed that there were 6 of them. Constable Andrew then guarded the front door, while Constable Wiley and Sergeant Stapp searched the dark, gloomy, and foul-smelling house. In the room across from David's, they found the 58-year-old Robin Bain's body. He was lying on his right side, with his feet pointed towards the door. Next to his right hand was a 5-round magazine with 3 bullets in it. A .22 semi-automatic Winchester rifle lay on the grounds behind his body, and a silencer had been attached to it. He had been shot in the left temple. Down the hallway to their right was a staircase that led to a lower section of the house, and next to it was a small cluttered bedroom. An ironing board stood in front of a freestanding wardrobe, and the majority of the right side of the room was dominated by an architect's drawing board that was filled with floor plans and other sketches. On the far side of the bedroom, the 18-year-old Laniat had been killed while she was still asleep in bed. She'd been shot in the head, a total of 3 times. The light in the bedroom, across from Laniat's, was turned on, and inside the room they found the 50-year-old Margaret's body. She'd also been asleep when she'd been shot, just above her left eye. The hallway led to a large, dark family room, but since it seemed to have been left untouched, police officers made their way downstairs where they found the kitchen and the laundry. To the right of the staircase, they came across the 19-year-old Arawa's bedroom. The doorway was covered with 2 curtains, a net and a bead curtain that was made with metal rings and tingled when you moved it. Arawa had gotten out of bed at some point during the attack, and based on the position of her body, it's speculated that she'd gotten onto her knees to plead for mercy before the killer shot her in the forehead. Sergeant Stapp and Constable Wiley cleared the house before confirming that they'd found 4 bodies, and Constable Stevenson told them that there had to be another one. During a second check of the house, Sergeant Stapp discovered another room that led out of Margaret's bedroom. The doorway had been covered with a curtain, and on the other side, he found Stephen's bedroom. The room was mostly used as a storage space, and about 3/4 of the bedroom was piled high with all kinds of junk. To the right side of the door was a wardrobe and a bed, and in the middle of the messy floor lay the body of 14-year-old Stephen Bane. He'd been wearing a white t-shirt and black shorts, but it was clear from the state of his body and the blood that covered the bed, the floor, and multiple surfaces in the bedroom that Stephen had fought back. He was covered in blood and scratches, and at one point his attacker had pulled on his shirt. One of his arms had come loose, and the t-shirt was then used to strangle him. He had sustained 3 bullet wounds during the attack, and it would later be theorized that he'd been awake when his attacker had come into the room. He'd shielded himself with his left hand when the first shot went off, and the bullet passed through his hands before nicking the right side of his head. Stephen then tried his best to fight off his attacker, but once he was subdued, his attacker shot him once again, this time with a kill shot to the head. When Sergeant Stapp confirmed that they'd found Stephen's body, David suffered a fit. His body started shaking and he fell in between the bed and the wall. Sergeant Stapp pulled David up, placed him in the recovery position, and called for the paramedics. One of the paramedics, Officer Raymond Anderson, came in to check on a still shaking David and would later explain that, quote, "During the visual and physical examination, I couldn't find any signs of injury, blood loss, deformity, any of those sorts of things that would give you an indication that you're looking at any sort of physical trauma at all. I tried to establish the level of consciousness because the patient was presenting as if unconscious. By lifting his eyelid and testing his reaction, I was able to determine that the patient was, in actual fact, quite conscious." Ooh, so is he faking it? Based on this and the fact that Sergeant Stapp had been able to easily lift David and place him into the recovery position, both Officer Anderson and Sergeant Stapp were of the opinion that David was faking his fit, which would later put a dent in his credibility. It also continued to mutter something about black hands coming to take him away, and when he was told that the police were going to take him to the hospital for a checkup, David asked the officer to hand him his glasses. The only pair of glasses they could find was a broken pair with a missing lens. The police officer put the glasses back where they'd found them and ordered David to put on some warmer clothes. Still crying, David was then taken away to hospital, and the police finally started processing the scene. Senior Constable Trevor Gardner was the senior photographic technician at the time, and he took both photos and a video of the crime scene, focusing on the clutter, the blood splatter, and the locations of several pieces of evidence. In David's room, they found the rifle's lock and key and thousands of rounds of ammunition. In the downstairs washing machine, they found a load of wet laundry and then went through the trouble of hanging the clothes out to dry. They also found several places where blood had been smeared following the attack. On the doorways leading out of Stephen and Margaret's room, several light switches, the doorway leading to the stairs, the doorway in Arawa's room, the doorway that led into the kitchen, the washing machine, and a bottle of laundry detergent. They also found a partial bloody palm print on the washing machine and took several photos of it before recording the handprints. In the week following the murders, luminol would be sprayed on various surfaces inside the house, and they revealed the presence of 6 bloody footprints that led out of Stephen's room, through Margaret's towards Laniat's, and then away toward the staircase. They also found traces of blood in the downstairs bathroom, mainly around the sink, on the bath mat, and on some of the towels. In Stephen's bedroom, they found a bullet casing and spent bullet on his pillow, which had ricocheted off the wall after nicking the side of his head. In the front room where Robin's body had been found, they found a spent bullet casing behind a set of green curtains that separated an alcove from the rest of the room. Whoever did this is leaving behind an awful lot of evidence, which seems like it's going to have an awful lot of fingerprints everywhere, no? Inside the alcove, they found Robin's computer, and on the screen there was a typed message that read, "Sorry, you are the only one who deserved to stay." The police also searched the caravan where Robin had lived. That sounds like something Margaret would write, not Robin. Like, Margaret's the one who thinks that her family are possessed by the devil, not Robin. He seems like a normal dad. Semi-normal. They also searched the caravan where Robin had lived and found an instruction manual that belonged to the rifle, along with 20 empty bullet casings. They checked the alarm on Robin's clock and confirmed that it had been set for 6:30. Just like the rest of the house, the caravan was a mess, and the police didn't find anything else of note there. Once the bodies were removed, the police tagged every spot of blood in Stephen's room and found 2 blood-soaked white formal gloves that belonged to David underneath the chair. They also found a lens from a set of glasses underneath some of the junk that covered the floor. The lens belonged to a set of broken glasses that had been found on a chair in David's room. The pathologist would later explain that he wasn't able to examine all the bodies at the scene, and as such, he didn't take their temperature, which meant that the police couldn't be exactly certain when the various members of the family had been killed. One of the paramedics later noted that when he had gone around to confirm the rest of the Bain family was dead, Robin's body had been warmer than the others, and forensic evidence would also help confirm that he was the last person to be shot with a rifle. All of the bodies had some form of blood splatter on them, but Stephen's body was covered in blood, scratches, and bruises. Robin was also noted to have several injuries on his hands, including cuts and bruises on his fingers, but the pathologist noted that the wounds had already dried out and could have been a few days old, and were most likely from when Robin had worked in the yard that past weekend. Scrapings were taken from underneath both Stephen and Robin's nails, and the scrapings from Stephen's nails included several green fibers that matched a green woolen sweater that had been found in the washing machine that morning. There were also spots of blood on Robin's hands and clothes, and the samples were taken to confirm who it belonged to. Now, David had been taken to the hospital where his clothes were removed and a doctor looked him over. The doctor noted that David was fit and in excellent health, but noted that he had a bump on his forehead, a scrape on his knee, and that his knuckles were red and bruised. David claimed that he had no recollection of how he had sustained these injuries. Despite the cold morning, he'd been wearing a white t-shirt, green cycling shorts, black rugby shorts, and a pair of socks when the police found him, and when they were later analysed, the police found blood smears on the front and back of his t-shirt, blood on the crotch of his shorts, and spots of blood on both the tops and soles of his white socks. They tested his hands for gunpowder residue, but the tests came back negative. Later that day, Detective Sergeant Milton Weir interviewed David and asked him to walk through the events of that weekend. David explained that everyone arrived at the house as planned on Friday and the family had dinner together. That Saturday, he and Robin worked to clear the backyard in preparation for the house that Margaret wanted to build, and that Sunday, he and Robin fought over a chainsaw. According to David, Robin wanted to take the chainsaw to the Tyeri Beach school so that he could cut some firewood, but David insisted that he needed the chainsaw so that he could continue his work in the garden. He'd also tell police that he had a very strained relationship with Robin. Because Margaret had been telling her kids for years that Robin was a worthless husband and the devil incarnate, David believed that Robin didn't have a place in the family and explained that Robin was sneaky and often listened in on conversations Margaret was having with their children. David also felt that Robin had mistreated Margaret and then explained that Margaret had dropped her teaching career in music studies to follow Robin to Papua New Guinea, and that once they arrived, had expected her to be the perfect little housewife. Now, yes, it doesn't sound like really something she does. Like, she's in charge. Now, years later, Robin was going to divorce her, and because she'd given everything to the family for years, Margaret would have been left with nothing, sentiments which were reflected in Margaret's numerous diaries and constant complaints about Robin. According to David, nothing unusual happened that Sunday night. David went to bed at around 8 p.m. Laniert and Margaret were in the living room watching TV, and later, David would hear raised voices. But David claimed that he couldn't hear what the argument was about because his room was on the opposite side of the house. That Monday morning, David woke up at around 5:30 a.m. He got dressed into his running clothes and left the house at 5:45 for his newspaper run. His dog, Cassie, always came with him, and the two of them ran his usual route, just as they always did. He got back home at around 6:42 a.m. and noticed that the light was on in Margaret's room, which wasn't unusual since she usually got up at 6:30 a.m. David would then make a cup of coffee for her once he came back from his newspaper run. But that morning, David went to his bedroom first. He didn't turn on his bedroom light, but took off his running shoes, hung up his yellow newspaper delivery bag behind the door, tossed his Walkman on his bed, and then made his way downstairs, again, still in the dark. He made his way to the laundry room and while he washed his hands to get rid of the black ink that usually stained them, he then took off his red sweatshirt, explaining that he was sweaty and warm after running his route that morning. He put his red sweatshirt in the washing machine, added some colored clothes from the washing basket, and then started the wash cycle. He went back upstairs, and when he turned on his bedroom light, he noticed there was a handful of bullets on the floor. He then saw that his rifle was lying on the ground and checked his wardrobe where he usually kept the rifle. It was gone. David then ran down towards Margaret's room, and when he pushed aside the curtain that acted as a door, he saw that Margaret had been shot. In shock, David then ran down toward the front door, intending to run around the house toward the caravan. Instead, he opened the door to the front room and saw Robin lying on the ground with the rifle next to him. David then shuffled past Robin's body, grabbed the phone, and called 111 for help. Now, initially, the police suspected that Robin had murdered the family and then killed himself, but after listening to David's version of events and reading the doctor's report on his examination of David's injuries, they began to suspect that David was the one who'd killed his family. They called him in for questioning on the 21st of June and explained that they'd run through his version of events, but they were missing about 20 minutes. According to the police, it would have taken just 10 minutes for David to come home, go downstairs, wash a load of laundry, go upstairs, and then discover his parents' bodies. So, what did he do in those 20 minutes? David claimed that he couldn't remember. He then explained that he'd been experiencing some lapses in his memory for some time, that he slipped into a sort of trance-like state, and minutes or hours would pass before he'd wake up again with no idea what had happened. The same thing had happened after he'd found his father's body. When he finally snapped out of it, he'd called for help. Then there was his call to 111. David had told the operator, "They're all dead." But during his first interview with police, he told them that he'd only seen the bodies of his parents. So how did he know that his siblings were dead as well? In answer, David only shrugged and explained that everything that had happened after he'd come across Robin's body was a blur and that he'd been in a fog until the police arrived. I mean, yeah, not unreasonable to be a bit shocked, is it? Needless to say, though, within days after his family's murders, David became murder suspect number 1. And on the 24th of June 1994, David Cullen Bane was arrested and charged with 5 counts of murder. Following David's arrest, his uncles took over his family estate, and after the police released the house to them, the decision was made to burn 65 Every Street to the ground, reducing it to a pile of ash and rubble. Okay, seems like a bit of an extreme reaction, even if the house was real messy. The murder trial of David Bain. In the months leading up to the murder trial, more and more evidence came forward that suggested that David was the one who murders his family, and the police were building an ironclad case against him. David wasn't handling his imprisonment well. He'd been targeted by the other inmates shortly after his arrival, which led to him being placed in a solitary cell, and because there was a concern that he would off himself, a guard checked in on him every 15 minutes, night or day, which reportedly severely impacted his sleep and left him exhausted. Yeah, if someone was like, "You're right, mate," every 15 minutes I'd be like, I'm sleeping. Also 15 minutes? How does it take to kill yourself? Is it long? I genuinely don't know. A court-appointed psychiatrist went to see David 6 weeks after the murders to assess him and determine whether or not he was mentally capable of standing trial, and David would later explain that his interviews with the psychiatrist was yet another form of torture since he was forced to relive the morning that he'd found his family's bodies over and over. The psychiatrist found that David suffered from PTSD following the discovery of his family's bodies, but he didn't show any indications of an abnormality of the mind or subnormal intelligence. In fact, he came across as quiet, kind, frank, and well-adjusted, and his lack of knowledge regarding certain societal norms could be attributed to the 14 years that he'd spent living in Papua New Guinea. Yeah, fair enough. I'm not sure why, he would need to be assessed to see whether he's fit to stand trial. Is that a standard thing? Because he doesn't seem to be, it's weird, the situation he grew up in and stuff, but he doesn't seem to be, incompetent. Yet it was only after these visits to the psychiatrist that David started remembering new details regarding the 20-minute gap. He explained that after he'd discovered his parents' bodies, he'd then wandered through the house in a sort of trance, checking in on the rest of his family members. He'd gone to Stephen's room and touched his body to check whether he was dead, and inadvertently got some of Stephen's blood on him. This had also resulted in his socks getting blood on them, so when he left Stephen's room, he left some bloody footprints in the hallway, which doesn't explain why his socks weren't covered in blood or how the blood got cleaned up, but okay. Yeah, that's a bit it's a bit weird, isn't it? He passed by Lanyard's room and heard that she was gurgling, but when he realized that nothing could be done for her, he kept on walking. He then wandered to Arawa's room to check on her before going back upstairs and calling the police, and these new recovered memories would become a key part of his defense during his murder trial. interesting. It seems fairly weak. Isn't it? I mean, if he didn't do it, then there's not really going to be strong physical evidence. I feel like there's going to be physical evidence. This is a messy crime scene by someone who doesn't really know what they're doing. David's murder trial started on the 8th of May 1995, almost a year after the murders had taken place, and was heard by Justice Neil Williamson at the Dunedin High Court. During the trial, David's lawyer, Michael Guest, argued that Robin was the one who'd committed the murders. He theorized that after being rejected by his family, Robin had simply snapped and decided to end their lives. He got up early and took the rifle from David's room before murdering every member of his family that was still in the house. He then stripped himself of his bloody clothing, got dressed in clean ones, and ended his own life after leaving a note to David on the computer, apologizing for his actions that morning. It's a bit weird that he'd get changed, isn't it? But it's not like, this is the thing. In a criminal trial, all you got to do is establish reasonable doubt. And this seems like a pretty good way to do it, to be honest, Mr. Guest. Guest then related David's recollection of what had happened that morning and explained that numerous people had seen David on his newspaper run, solidifying his alibi. The Crown, on the other hand, argued that David was the one who had murdered his entire family. They theorized that on the morning of the murders, David had gotten up at around 5 a.m. He then got dressed in his cycling shorts, black rugby shorts, dark-colored track pants, a green sweater, and socks. What's this guy wearing? How many clothes do you have to wear? He's wearing cycling shorts, rugby shorts, and track pants. Why are you wearing 3 sets of trousers? What's going on? He put on his glasses and white opera gloves, took his rifle out of the wardrobe, and added the silencer so he wouldn't wake up his potential victims and wouldn't alarm Robin, who was still asleep in the caravan outside. Bro doesn't realize that silencers are a bit shit. What was his weapon, a 22? Okay, it's a pretty quiet gun. But like a silencer is really just a suppressor. It's not like in the movies. That shit's going to wake people up. David unlocked the trigger lock using a key that was hidden in an ornamental pot on his desk, and then loaded the rifle with a 5-round magazine. He stalked out of the room and took out each member of his family. Laniet was first, followed by Margaret. Stephen had woken up and was sitting upright in bed when David entered his room. He shielded himself with his hands when the first shot went off and then jumped up and fought his older brother for control of the rifle. David eventually managed to overpower his 14-year-old brother and then killed him. Now covered in Stephen's blood, David took off the bloody gloves so that he could reload the rifle, and he dropped them on the floor, and they left Stephen's room, leaving 6 bloody footprints in his wake. When he passed Laniet's room, he heard that she was gurgling, so he entered her room and shot her another 2 times at close range to ensure that she was dead, which resulted in her blood ending up on his clothes. He then made his way downstairs, leaving more traces of Stephen's blood on doorways and on the banister before entering Arawa's room. The first shot misfired, and Arawa woke up and got out of bed and begged him not to kill her. He shot her, and then left the room, and headed towards the laundry. There he took off the bloodied sweater, track pants, and socks and threw them in the wash, leaving bloody handprints on the side of the washing machine and smears of blood on the detergents, and then started the washing machine. This is some amateur-level crime. It's like, what I'll do is I'll wash the blood off my clothes while smearing blood all over the washing machine. What the f*** are you doing? He washed his hands and face in the bathroom, leaving smears of blood behind, and then took his rifle upstairs and placed it in his room before putting on a red sweatshirt and his running shoes and heading off on his newspaper rounds. He came back at 6:42 a.m. and took off his shoes and his Walkman. He hung up the yellow bag he used to deliver newspapers, then took his rifle and headed to the front room, where he turned on the computer and at 6:44 a.m. typed the message. He then hid behind the curtains in the alcove as he waited for his father, fully aware that Robin would come into the front room to pray, and when he did, David quietly stepped up to his father's side and shot him in the left temple. David then wiped the rifle down with a green towel to remove his fingerprints and arranged the rifle and magazine around Robin's body to make it look like Robin had killed himself. David then put his red sweatshirt, the bloody towel, and some other clothes in the wash and turned on the washing machine. He then went back upstairs, cleaned the bloody footprints in the hall so that the police wouldn't notice them. Bruh. Mate, what are you doing? You cleaning them with, bleach for hours? Because otherwise they're just going to luminol that shit. He then called 111 and reported that all the members of his family were dead. And the Crown had tons of evidence to prove their theory. The rifle that was used to murder the 5 members of the Bain family had belonged to David. He had admitted to buying the silencer the previous year because he claimed that it was easier to hunt rabbits when they weren't being startled by the sound of gunfire. David told the court that he had 2 keys for the rifle lock, one he kept around his neck and one that he kept in the ornamental pot on his desk. He'd left the one he usually kept around his neck in Robin's van when they'd taken part in the polar plunge the previous week, and David had admitted that he was the only one who knew where the second key was kept. Then there was the forensic evidence. I have to say, all of this, this is a ton of circumstantial evidence. This is, okay, so, but the dad also potentially had a key because he said he left it in the trailer. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Reasonable doubt? Yeah, probably. If I'm on the jury, I'm like, you got to do better than this. Then there was the forensic evidence. They had Stephen and Laniette's blood on David's clothing, Robin's blood on the tops of David's socks, droplets of Stephen's blood on the soles of David's socks, and David's bloody fingerprints on the rifle. Uh-oh, this is looking a bit more like a lock-in to me. They had David's bloody opera gloves and one of his lenses in Stephen's room, and the spent bullet casings behind the curtain in the alcove, as well as his bloody handprints on the washing machine. Yeah, now we're talking, this is beyond circumstantial, isn't it? This is looking like real proper evidence. The length of the footprints in the hall matched the length of David's feet, and furthermore, Constables Kim Stevenson would add that he had gotten the impression that the scene around Robin's body had been staged. Quote, "I was immediately struck by the magazine on its narrow edge right next to Mr. Bain's head. Right away, I thought something wasn't right." Yeah, and when a detective feels something isn't right and just can't put their finger on it, that's not just like, oh, he just feels that way. It's because he's got so much experience and so much, knowledge that he's like, something's wrong. He's seen so many crime scenes that he's like, this isn't right. Can't put my finger on why, but this isn't right. Constable Stevenson explained that they were supposed to get the impression that the magazine had fallen out of Robin's hand after his body had collapsed on the floor. But by his reasoning, this meant that the magazine should have ended up on its side, not standing upright on its narrow edge, as if somebody had carefully placed it there. David claimed that he couldn't remember turning the lights on in the house, but there were bloody smudges on all the light switches. Yet David also claimed that he'd made his way through the dark, messy, and disorganized house after coming across his parents' bodies and somehow managed to see that all of his family members had died. Those bat ears of his must have given him the ability to see in the dark. Savage. The Crown also had various witnesses who explained that both Laniette and Arawa told multiple people that David was the one who'd called for a family meeting that weekend. Arawa also told a friend of hers that David used to go hunting with Robin, but the idea of having a rifle inside the house made her uncomfortable. Both of them seemed to have been afraid of David and complained that he was often controlling. Yes, and we know this about David, just like his mum. These witnesses were all used to reinforce the idea that David was obsessive, disturbed, and that his behavior was often bizarre. He does sound like an odd cookie, doesn't he? And I have to say, if I'm sitting in that jury box, I'm going to need the defense now to do some work, because this forensic stuff is pretty fucking suspicious, isn't it? David had told his girlfriend at the time that he had a feeling that something bad was going to happen, though he wasn't sure what. It's a weird thing to say. Makes you look like a criminal, David, doesn't it? Margaret had also mentioned to a friend of hers that David was having premonitions and that she was concerned about this newfound ability of his. David's apparent memory loss was also brought up by both sides. During his first interview with the police, he explained that he'd gone into one during a practice session with Opera Live that previous week. His friends told him that he'd just gotten up and started walking around aimlessly, almost as if he was sleepwalking. Then there was David's claim that he'd heard Laniette gurgle when he discovered her body. Sleepwalking is an interesting one. If anything, if there's a trial in the future and I bring up sleepwalking defense or whatever, after, I'm accused of multiple murders, I'll say it here right now. I sleepwalk occasionally. Have it on the record. Great. Now I've got my defense for future crimes sorted. Sleepwalking's a weird one. I do it every few years. Just start wandering around. I don't know what I'm doing. Just turning on lights, wandering around. My wife's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I got no idea. Coming back to bed." It's weird. Then there was David's claim that he'd heard Laniette gurgle when he discovered her body. According to the pathologist, the first shot to her head hadn't killed Laniette since it was too low. Instead, it knocked her unconscious, and after some time, it caused blood to pool in her lungs, resulting in the gurgles. The other two shots had entered her brain and killed her instantly, which would have stopped the gurgling and effectively put her out of her misery. Only the killer would have heard Laniette gurgle. And then the Crown called on numerous witnesses who suggested that David had been planning the murders for some time and that had been working on creating an alibi for himself in the week leading up to the murders. An old school friend of David's told the court that David had once told him that he fantasized about attacking their neighbor's daughter and sexually assaulting her. She used to go for a run in the mornings, and David would pass her while he delivered the newspapers. He'd planned the attack all out in a notebook. Bruh, rule number 1, don't write down your crimes or potential crimes. And he had a list of all the neighbors who usually saw him during his route, so he decided to deliver the rest of his newspapers earlier than usual. He'd then attack the girl, and afterwards he'd run the route again, ensuring that the other neighbors saw him and could later confirm that he'd been delivering newspapers as per usual. David claimed that this story was all hearsay, but 3 of his neighbors confirmed that they'd seen David delivering papers earlier than usual that morning. Oh, Dave, this is some solid work by the prosecution. The only reason I'm doubting this a bit is because Emma at the beginning of the script says, and you'll have to decide who's guilty. There's not really certainty. I'm like, God damn, if I'm in that jury box, in my opinion, I'm voting guilty. One of his neighbors, a Mrs. Denise Laney, explained that on the morning of the murders, she drove past 65 Every Street on her way to work. She saw a tall, thin young man standing next to the gate of 65 Every Street and assumed that it must have been David because he was wearing a yellow sports bag. Since it was still dark out, she couldn't be sure who it was, and she couldn't say whether or not he was wearing short pants or long ones that morning. She did remember thinking that she must be late for a 6:45 a.m. shift since she usually encountered him further down the street, about a 2-minute jog away from his house. She had glanced at the clock on her dashboard and noted that it was 6:50 a.m., but since she knew that her clock was 4 to 5 minutes fast, she estimated that it had to be around 6:45 a.m., but she couldn't be sure. But since she wasn't late for work, it proved to her that David had been a few minutes earlier than usual that morning. And then Mrs. Kathleen Mitchell testified that David had made a point of ensuring that she knew he'd been at her house that morning. Because his dog, Cassie, always ran with him, she'd asked David not to come onto her front porch when he delivered the newspaper because her dog would start barking and wake her up. David had complied with her wishes for months, but then that morning he'd ignored it, and when her dog started barking between 6:10 and 6:15 a.m., she had turned on the porch light and greeted David, who at this point was standing at her front door. This is so suspicious, David, you amateur. Then there was David's behavior in the weeks following the murders. David had gone to live with his aunt and uncle. Wait, did he got bail? Holy sh**. Really? David had gone to live with his aunt and uncle, Robert and Janice Clark, in the days following the murders, and they tried their best to find out what had happened that weekend that could have resulted in Robin killing the rest of his family. David told him that nothing unusual had happened that weekend. He explained that there was some tension in the house, but that there was always some tension in the house whenever Robin was home because nobody wanted him there. When the local newspapers started to report on the murders, the family tried to keep David from reading the papers, but it insisted on reading the various news reports since the police still hadn't shared anything with the family. They had a copy of the Otago Daily Times in the house, and it provided a brief background on the family. The only description of the crime itself was, quoting, "All the victims had been shot in the head. Some were found in their beds, others beside their beds. The body of Robin Bane had been found in the lounge of the large, run-down, twin-gabled villa. A .22 rifle with a silencer attached had been beside his body," police said. David got visibly upset when reading the article, and when his aunt went to check up on him, a distressed David reportedly told her, "They lied to me. They weren't asleep. They knew they were going to die. I had to look them in the eye and shoot them." David, you're breaking all the rules. David then followed this up by muttering, black hands, dying. Black hands, I can't stop them. They came to take them away. Black hands dying all around, dying everywhere." His muttering went on for quite some time, and when his Aunt Janice worriedly asked him if he'd seen his family dying, David calmed down, shook his head, and said, "No, I only saw Mum and Dad, and they were already dead." David's girlfriend at the time came for a visit the Tuesday after the murders, and she'd later explained that, quote, "I didn't want to ask him too much, but we did talk a bit. He was very upset that Arawa was out of bed, and that Stephen had to fight." David, what? Wait, you're just wandering around telling everyone about your crimes. Why, David? What are you doing? When she'd also asked him if he'd seen any of his siblings' bodies, he said no, he'd only seen his parents, and when she asked him how he knew that Stephen and Arawa's bodies had been found outside their beds, David told her that he'd read about it in the newspaper despite there being no mention about where their bodies had been found. Emma, I just think David is so guilty. What is the twist in this story? David then told her that if his father had killed his family, he'd never forgive him. And when David explained that he's not even sure that he isn't the one who killed them, his girlfriend was quick to reassure him that she knew he'd never be capable of doing something like that. He's like, "I'm not sure if I killed them." When Robin and Margaret's family started making plans for the funeral, they worried that it would be too traumatic for David to be involved in the planning. But according to his aunt, Val Boyd, David had already planned his family members' funerals in detail. He'd already decided what everyone would wear, what songs would be played, who was going to say the eulogies, where it was going to take place, and that he was going to sing a song in tribute. He wanted them to play Who Wants to Live Forever by Queen in remembrance of Laniet, and told them that he didn't want the family to wear black to the funeral because we see death as a celebration. David. I don't even know what to say anymore, David. Come on. David had gone to visit his friend Shane Stanley the Thursday after the murders took place, and afterwards, Shane told his parents that he was convinced that David had murdered his family. Furthermore, his father, Graham Stanley, was a corrections officer in the prison where David was held after his arrest, and he told journalist Martin van Bainen that the nurses and doctors were often called to David's cell because David was having fits. But Graham told his superiors that he'd never known David to suffer from fits, and when he heard that David was having another fit, he went to his cell and, quote, I threw the door open and I walked straight in, and David was on the floor having his fit. And I said, David, what the hell do you think you're doing? And he stopped. Midstream, stopped dead. I didn't know you were on duty today, Graham. I told him, you don't have fits, David. Cut it out. And I said, that's the end, no more. And there wasn't. That was the end of his fits. God damn, dude, you couldn't look more guilty. When the psychologist was called in to deliver an opinion on David's mental state at the time of the murders, the Crown was able to provide two possible motives for David: money and Margaret's toxic influence over him. Yeah, I would go with the latter, probably. They explained that David had been eager to please his mother and did what he could to keep the family together and keep a measure of control over their actions. A part of this was to ensure that Robin was not able to abuse Margaret and to ensure that the rest of the family would be able to live together happily ever after in the sanctuary that Margaret had been planning. David had spent months working on the project and had spent hours poring over the plans with Margaret and believed that it was the key to keeping his family free from Robin's influences. But then Margaret told a friend of hers that she was going to divorce Robin, and they were going to sell 65 Every Street and split the proceeds. Laniet was already living on her own, Arawa was already planning on moving out, and David was old enough to fend for himself. Margaret planned on getting a smaller house in town where she and Stephen could live, but that meant the sanctuary would never be built, and all of David's hard work was for nothing. Murdering his entire family might have been David's last-ditch attempt to keep them all together and safe from the evil of the world, and would have meant that he would have inherited the property as well as Robin's retirement annuity. This narrative was further supported by the statements of the witnesses who'd all claimed that David was odd, weird, controlling, and wanted to oversee everything his sisters did, a trait he'd inherited from the controlling, emotionally abusive, toxic, and extremely dangerous Margaret Bain. Of course, when it was the defense's turn to defend their case, they argued that the police's case against David was circumstantial. Yeah, I mean, some of it is, but also some of it's some pretty fucking locked-in forensics, isn't it? And then, all the shit that he talked. For all they knew, Robin had carefully placed the magazine on the floor before he offed himself. Their ballistics experts confirmed that there was blood inside the silencer, which could only happen if Robin had been shot from close range, resulting in the blood entering the vacuum left by the bullet. But neither the defense nor the Crown could prove whether Robin had killed himself. The defense had a ballistics expert demonstrate how easily Robin would have been able to shoot himself in the left temple, leaving behind both a contact and a non-contact wound. If David was the one who shot Robin, he would have had to stand next to Robin and almost press the rifle against Robin's head before shooting him, something Robin definitely would have noticed. Yeah, but you can also be like, do not move. And then the person's like, oh, okay, and then pop. Doesn't seem like a very good defense, to be honest. The police themselves said that the rifle had been wiped down at some point. Wouldn't that have smudged David's bloody fingerprints that the Crown had argued had been left on the rifle? Are they even sure that those fingerprints weren't made when he was out hunting rabbits and possums with Robin? Well, aren't they bloody? After all, the police hadn't tested the blood and couldn't say whether or not the blood was human. Oh, come on. And yes, there wasn't any blood on the bottom of Robin's socks, but the blood on the bottom of David's socks was also just a few droplets, not nearly enough to leave behind several bloody footprints. Since the Crown was arguing that David had stripped off the top layer of his clothes, why couldn't Robin have done the same before he got ready to meet his maker? Because one is covering up a crime, and one is just weird, bizarre behavior. I don't think the person who's about to kill themselves is thinking very much about their socks. And speaking of clothes, the green fibers that had been found underneath Stephen's fingernails had been matched to a green knit sweater that had been placed in the wash that morning, leading the police to believe that the killer had worn it. Initially, David had explained that the sweater belonged to Arawa, but later he'd claimed that it actually belonged to Robin. Arawa just liked to wear it because it was baggy. David also later explained that Robin had been wearing that sweater on both Saturday and Sunday and suggested that he'd worn it again that Monday morning. Of course, no one had gone to visit the family that weekend, so no one could confirm who'd worn what, but the defense did ask David to put the green sweater on in front of the jury, proving that the sweater was too small for David's lanky frame and that the sweater obviously didn't belong to David. And the defense claimed that the police hadn't done a proper job when they'd analysed the evidence. They hadn't tested Robin's hands for gunpowder residue. They also didn't find any on David's hands, but by his own admission, he'd washed them after he returned from the newspaper run. The police also hadn't tested the blood that was found on Robin's hands and clothes, and thus the Crown couldn't say with absolute certainty that he didn't have any blood belonging to the rest of his victims on his body. Then there were the footprints. The Crown hadn't preserved the carpets on which the bloody footprints were found, and this meant that the defense wasn't able to have their own experts look at the footprints. They all had to rely on the photos that had been taken that morning, so how could they say with certainty that those footprints did indeed belong to David? And then there was the lens that had been found in Stephen's room. Could they even be sure that it had fallen out that morning? The police had found it lying underneath some clothes, so there was a possibility that the Crown's assumption that it had fallen out during a fight with Stephen was wrong. And then there was the washing machine. According to David, it turned it on shortly after he arrived home. The wash cycle usually took an hour, so was the machine still running when the police officers arrived at 7:20 a.m? If it was, it would confirm David's claims that he only started the wash cycle after he got home and refute the Crown's theory that he'd washed his bloody clothes shortly before he'd left the house that morning. And yet no one could confirm whether or not the washing machine was still on when the police arrived at the scene. Yeah, because they're not paying attention to that. They're paying attention to all the bodies. They're not like, oh yeah, someone's doing some laundry. You just wouldn't pay attention to that. Worse still, the police had allowed the family to burn 65 Every Street to the ground just 2 weeks after the murders took place, destroying any further evidence that David might have been able to use to prove his innocence. Or the prosecution could have used to prove his guilt. Like, what? All this suggested that the police were doing everything they could to pin the murders on the innocent 22-year-old David. Maybe. But also, he's the prime suspect. They should go into it level-headed, but I mean, goddamn. But all of their protests fell on deaf ears. On May the 29th, 1995, the jury declared that David Cullen Bane was guilty on all 5 charges of murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the option of parole after serving 16 years of his sentence. Good. Wow, 16 years for multiple murders. Pretty light, New Zealand. Good and well deserved, right? Well, no, because the defense argued that the judge had refused to admit several pieces of evidence that would have proved that David Bane hadn't murdered his family. So David embarked on a 14-year battle to prove his innocence. Holy shit. Okay, there's the twist. There's evidence that didn't even make it to court that we haven't heard about so far. Right now, I think they probably squeezed me, a theoretical jury person, towards this is beyond reasonable doubt that he's guilty. But I imagine if this evidence is included, that's going to push me back the other way. Let's see. The rugby player and the Court of Appeals. David's first appeal was lodged with the Independent Police Conduct Authority, or IPCA, shortly after his sentencing. In it, David's defense team argued that Justice Williamson had refused to admit several pieces of evidence that would have helped to prove David Bane was innocent. However, it wasn't considered to be sufficient to prove his innocence, and the application to appeal was dismissed on the 19th of December 1995. David couldn't afford to appeal his case any further, and in 1996, his old music teacher and some of his friends were selling fruit preservatives on the roadside to raise more money that he needed to appeal his conviction. An ex-rugby player named Joe Karam saw an article in the newspaper about it and did later explain that, quote, "I was captured by the fact that they were so devoted to him. I wanted to help them because I didn't know anything about the David Bane case at the time. And I thought, well, I'll send down my $100 and put my little bit in the kitty." Karam did end up donating to the cause, but then he went on to read up on David's case. Karam even went so far as to go and visit David Bane in prison, and there he became convinced that the unassuming, soft-spoken, and guileless David Bane couldn't have murdered his entire family. David told Karam that he'd been railroaded, that there was more to the story than the police or media knew, and that if the judge hadn't refused to admit certain evidence, and that if the police hadn't allowed David's family to burn 65 Every Street to the ground, David wouldn't have been found guilty of murdering his family. David's insistence that he was innocent impressed Karam, who decided that he'd do anything he could to help David Bain prove his innocence. After all, he used to play for the All Blacks, New Zealand's national rugby team, and as Matt Ochard explained in the video, the only one who deserved to stay, the case of David Bain, quote, New Zealanders really like rugby. Like, we really like rugby. There's no simple explanation as to why the game is such an integral component of our country's cultural DNA. Our national rugby team, the All Blacks, regularly wipe the floor with countries that have 20 times our populace, and boy, are we proud of them for it. So if you're good enough at rugby to become an All Black, you're endowed with a kind of aura that sets you apart from the rest of the populace. In New Zealand, if you have public image problems you really need to work on, like for instance, pretty much everyone thinks that you killed your family, having an All Black in your corner is a big plus. Now, as a South African and fan of the Springboks, Emma, not me, our national rugby team, I can confirm here rugby players are treated a lot like NFL players in the US or football stars in the UK. However, I also want to point out that we'd totally kicked All Black ass during the final game of the last Rugby World Cup and have won the Rugby World Cup for the second year in a row this past October, so boo boo. little snark there. Anyway, Joe Karam firmly put himself in David's corner and ended up becoming his biggest advocate. During an interview with journalist Jeff Cumming for his 2007 article, Joe Karam, Freedom Fighter, Karam explains that, I very naively believed all I would do was take my concerns to the authorities who would take over from there. Unbelievably, they didn't. They thought I was the enemy. Stories about David were written which were not properly researched. It started to feel like you're the only person who's seen a Martian walking down Queen Street. And so, Joe Karam launched his own PR campaign on behalf of David Bain. He loudly told anyone who would listen that David was innocent and that they had the evidence to prove it. He even wrote 4 books on the subject, and his claims had other people looking into the case as well. Holy shit, this guy's found his mission. God damn, good for you, Joe. And when it was revealed that the police had gotten rid of all the untested forensic evidence in the Bain murder case just a year after David was sentenced, what? You've got giant warehouses police for storing all of this shit. I've seen movies. It really stoked the fire, and the theory that the police were conspiring against David gains new traction. Karam would later explain that his ardent support of David lost him the respect of a lot of people, and that the mainstream media, judiciary, and politicians just thought of me as a raving redneck who'd lost the plot. Karam hired a new legal team, and in October 2000 they petitioned the Governor-General of New Zealand, aka King Charles's representative in New Zealand, which still recognises King Charles as their monarch. Oh yeah, New Zealand's part of the Commonwealth. I forgot about that. To pardon David Bain. The Governor-General then sent David's case to the Ministry of Justice for review, and 3 new judges were appointed to review David's case. The Governor-General posed 6 unresolved questions to the judges, and 42 witnesses submitted affidavits to help answer these questions. And we're quoting here. Number 1, was the computer turned on at a time earlier than 6:44 a.m. on the 20th of June 1994, or at the very least, is there a reasonable possibility that the computer could have been turned on at a time earlier than 6:44 a.m. on that date? 2, did the lens that was found in Stephen Bain's bedroom get there at a time or in a way that was unrelated to the murders, or at the very least, is there a reasonable possibility that this could have been so? 3, were the applicant's positive fingerprint marks made in blood that were found on the rifle used to commit the murders put there at some time before the murders, or at the very least, is there a reasonable possibility this could have been so? 4, was the submission made by the Crown solicitor in the Crown's closing address to the jury at the applicant's trial that only one person could have heard Lanier gurgling? That person is the murderer, wrong or misleading? 5, does the Court of Appeal's opinion on these questions indicate that there is credible and cogent evidence available that might, if it had been placed before the jury along with the other evidence given at the applicant's trial, have reasonably led the jury to return a different verdict? Yeah, this stuff should have been in the trial. What the f***? Number 6, having regard to the Court of Appeal's decision on question 5, is there a possibility that there has been a miscarriage of justice that would warrant the question of the applicant's convictions being referred to the Court of Appeal? The quote ends. Now, based on the affidavits received, the judges would later explain that there was a chance that the computer had been turned on before David was seen returning home, indicating that Robin was the one who turned the computer on. The judges couldn't decide whether or not the lens had already been in Stephen's room before the murders took place, and explained that a full trial would have to be held to decide it. As for the blood on the rifle, It hadn't been tested. So the question of whether it was human blood remained. The judges also explained that yes, the Crown's claim that only the killer could have heard Laniette's gurgles was misleading. And yes, if the evidence presented to them was presented to another jury, their verdict might have been different than the first. And as such, they found that, quote, there is a possibility that there has been a miscarriage of justice that would warrant the question of David Bain's convictions being referred to the Court of Appeals. So, on the 24th of February 2003, oh my god, it's 8 years later. If this dude's innocent, he's been in prison for 8 years already. A third appeal was made, this time to the Court of Appeals, and in their judgment, the judges reviewing the case declared that, quote, in the context of all the evidence, any reasonable jury must, in our view, have seen the case against David as proved beyond reasonable doubt. Wow, okay. They further explained that the defense hadn't supplied them with any new evidence that would prove David's innocence, and that the fundamental point that the ultimate issue, whether an accused person is guilty or not guilty, is for a jury, not for judges. The appellate court acts as a screen through which the further evidence must pass. It is not the ultimate arbiter of guilt, save in the practical sense that this is the effect of applying the ruling that the new evidence could not possibly have affected the result. The quote ends. David's new legal team and Joe Karam got together and went through all the pieces of evidence that had been collected, all the witness statements that were made, talked to more and more people, and came up with new information to prove their case. This time, they took their case to the highest possible court they could, the Privy Council in the UK. Yeah, that's because that's the highest court for Commonwealth countries. According to Wikipedia, His Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council, as it's officially known, is a formal body of advisors to the Sovereign of the United Kingdom and mainly consists of senior politicians who are current or former members of either the House of Commons or the House of Lords. The Privy Council also includes several separate committees, like the Executive Committee, aka the Cabinet of the United Kingdom, the Judicial Committee, which is the final court of appeals for Crown dependencies, British Overseas Territory, select military matters, and some Commonwealth countries, though by 2004 most Commonwealth countries, like New Zealand, had passed on their rights to appeal to the Privy Council. However, because David Bain's sentencing had taken place before then, he was still allowed to appeal, and in March 2007, Joe Karam and David's legal team travelled to London to make their case in front of the Judicial Committee, which included notable figures such as the late Lord Thomas Bingham of Cornwall, who has been described as being the greatest judge of his generation, the late Lord Alan Roger of Earlsferry, who would later become a Justice of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, Baroness Brenda Hale of Richmond, who was the President of the Supreme Court of the UK until her retirement in January 2020, the late Lord Simon Brown of Eton-under-Hayward, who also served as a Justice on the Supreme Court of the UK, and Sir Paul Kennedy, the former Vice President of the Queen's Bench Division of the High Court of Justice of England and Wales. So these are some big wig judge dudes. They are very important. Both the Crown and David's legal team presented several new pieces of evidence that weren't heard at David's first trial, and on the 10th of May 2007, the committee delivered their ruling and explained the way in which the case had been presented to the jury during the first trial back in 1995 had been misleading, and that, quote, a substantial miscarriage of justice has actually occurred. The board concludes that, as asked by the appellant, the appeal should be allowed, the convictions quashed, and a retrial ordered. Excellent. This seems like the right way to go forward. They're not saying he's innocent. They're not saying set him free. They're just saying he needs another trial because the first one wasn't right. Bang on. What was it called? Privy Council. Bang on. David Bain was released on bail into Joe Karam's custody on the 15th of May 2007. Oh, my birthday. After serving my 20th birthday. After serving 13 years in prison, and his defense team prepared to once again prove his innocence in court. The second murder trial of David Bain. David Bain's second murder trial took place on the 6th of March 2009 and lasted almost 3 months. He was represented by Queen's Counsel, aka senior trial lawyer Michael Reed, Joe Karam, and Matthew Karam, who is Joe's son and a qualified barrister/advocate. Cool. During the trial, the defense focused on what would later become known as the 9 points. In other words, the 9 pieces of evidence that challenged the Crown's version of what had happened that day. Point number 1. Robin's mental state at the time of the murders. During the first trial, the Crown had made a point of describing Robin as having been a respected principal, a good colleague, and a devout Christian. Even though he'd been separated from his wife, they'd still managed to get along and they were busy working through their issues. The defense, though, had since found 3 new witnesses who were willing to testify that in the weeks leading up to the murders, Robin's life had seemingly been falling apart. Kevin Mackenzie was the president of the Tyeri Principals Association at the time, explained that he and the other principals in the area had all noted that Robin was deeply depressed, and they did what they could to help him. 3 days after the murders, Mr. Mackenzie went to visit Robin's school and found that Robin had approved the publication of a newsletter that contained several dark and disturbing stories that had been written by the students. These stories are described as being sadistic, and at least one of them described the murder of an entire family. Mr. Mackenzie explained that the newsletter was the clearest possible evidence that Robin Bane had lost touch with reality due to his mental state. I mean, again, it's not really evidence, it's like circumstantial, but on that side of the equation, all you gotta do is be like, hey, maybe it was Robin. Maybe it was Robin, look at that. Maybe it was. Where the other guy's gotta be like, it absolutely is. And I'll say that's pretty good for persuading a jury towards reasonable doubt. Marianne Pease, a former teacher and registered psychologist, had also visited the school and concluded that the stories contained in the newsletter was proof that at the time Robin was, quote, quite seriously disturbed. In response to this, the Crown argued that there wasn't any indication that Robin had actually approved the publication of these stories. Neither was there any proof that he'd taught the children who'd written those stories. It was all a simple coincidence. Ingrid Dunkley, a psychologist for the Ministry of Education, told the court that, quote, children write all sorts of stories, and it depends on the context of the classroom, what the topic was at the time. I don't see the link between the stories and Robin Bane's mental state. Point number 2. The 5 bloody sock prints. During the first trial, David had admitted that it was entirely possible that he'd trampled bloody footprints through the house while he was walking around in a daze. The Crown had also explained that there was no evidence that Robin had been in either Margaret or Laniette's room that morning, so it was impossible for him to have made those footprints. As such, the evidence surrounding the footprints were mostly ignored by both the judge and the jury, with the judge saying that, quote, it need not have been called since all the accused now says supports the evidence that those footprints were his and that he went into those rooms and got wet blood on his socks. And here's why that's a problem. Luminol fades after just 30 seconds, so during their investigation, the forensics team had measured the footprints by having the forensic investigator place his thumb at the ends of the brightly lit luminol footprint before they took a photo. A police officer then took a measurement of the space between the forensic investigator's fingers once the lights were turned on. But 2 weeks after the murders, the house at 65 Ebury Street had been burned down, which had destroyed the carpet and any and all evidence that might have been overlooked by the police. As such, the Crown and the defense had to rely on the photos of the footprints, the police officers' measurements, and the opinions of the experts who'd analysed them in order to build their case, and during the second trial, these experts were once again called to testify. According to these experts, the footprints were mostly partials, but contained imprints of both the toes and the heel, and the footprint in total was estimated to be 280 millimeters long. Before the second trial, Joe Karam had personally measured David's feet and explained that they were 300 millimeters long. During his autopsy, the pathologist had measured Robin's feet and noted they were 270 millimeters. But the experts had explained that imprints, and especially bloody imprints, were often larger than the person's actual feet. So the imprints on the insides of David's shoes were measured, and they were 304 millimeters long. Imprints on the inside of Robin's shoes were 275 millimeters long. 5 millimeters, half a centimeter, or is that like a quarter of an inch? That's not a lot of error room. Then the defense explained that during the first trial, the Crown hadn't presented those measurements to the jury. Instead, they'd presented measurements of David and Robin's socks, because, as we all know, socks are rigid and they never lose their shape. David's socks measured in at 270 millimeters and Robin's at 240, so the Crown had argued that there was no way that Robin's feet could have made those bloody footprints in the hall. So, to drive the point home that David had not made those footprints, the defense's expert had him wear socks that had been dipped in animal blood before having him walk over a carpet. Those measurements were then taken, and they measured between 306 and 312 millimeters, too big to have made an imprint that measured just 280 millimeters. Yeah, that is pretty. That sort of carpet, like, practical thing in the courtroom is going to impress the jury. They're going to be like, God damn, I remember that. That's some good lawyering right there. Point number 3, the message on the computer. During the first trial, the Crown explained that David had turned the computer on when he returned home after delivering the newspapers, typed the message, and then waited for Robin in the curtained-off alcove in the front room. At the time, a computer technician who'd been employed by the University of Otago had explained that when they'd downloaded the file the next day, the computer had already been on for 31 hours and 32 minutes. Detective Constable Anderson had accompanied him and had noted the time was 2:16 p.m. Working back, that meant that the computer had been turned on at around 6:44 a.m. During his first interrogation, interrogation, David had told the police that he'd returned home at around 6:42 a.m., which would have meant that he'd been home when the computer was turned on, and supported the Crown's theory that he had been the one to kill Robin. Okay, seems pretty good. But in the years following David's first trial, it was revealed that DC Anderson's watch was inaccurate. Not only was it 2 minutes late, but it didn't have a second hand, aka the long one. Yes. Thank you. I want to explain that to my 4-year-old. What's that? That's the second hand. So it would have made it almost impossible to judge the time correctly. Further evidence had also indicated that the computer might have been turned off as early as 6:39 a.m., which is before David returned home. So the actual turn-on time of the computer is between 6:39 and 6:42 a.m., which brings us to point number 4. When did David return home that morning? During the first trial, one of his neighbours, Mrs. Laney, had reported that she'd seen a young man outside 65 Every Street at 6:50 a.m. However, she knew that her clock was a few minutes early. But why does no one have their clock set on the right time? What's going on? How hard is this? So it's entirely possible that he'd been home earlier than that. Back in 1994, she hadn't seemed certain of the time and hadn't even been able to positively identify David because it was still dark out, so her evidence had also been dismissed. During the second trial, it was revealed that a police constable had checked her car's clock shortly after she'd made her statement and had noted that it was indeed 5 minutes fast, which meant that she'd seen David enter 65 Every Street at 6:45 a.m. According to the defense, that meant that the computer had already been turned on and that Robin had already been dead when David returned home that morning. Yeah, I mean, it's all very... all of the clocks could be wrong. The computer clock can also be wrong. It's 1994. It's not like it's syncing with the internet. I mean, maybe it is, but probably not. Point number 6. The glasses. During the first trial, David explained that in the week leading up to the murders, he'd broken his glasses, which were then sent in for repairs. He also explained that he and Margaret wore a similar prescription, so when he didn't have access to his glasses, he'd wear hers, but he was also insistent that he hadn't worn any glasses that weekend. The Crown had argued that he'd worn glasses that weekend, and that during the struggle with Stephen, the left side lens had fallen out. The bent pair of glasses that was missing the left side lens were later found in David's room, where he'd tossed them onto a chair. His Aunt Janice even testified that she'd seen him wearing his mother's glasses that week, and later, the optometrist who'd prescribed the glasses agreed that they'd belonged to Margaret. During the first trial, the jury were shown pictures of Stephen's messy room, and Detective Sergeant Weir had pointed to where he'd found the lens, explaining that, quote, "You can just make out the edge of the spectacle lens just in front of the ice skating boot." Later, he admitted that it wasn't actually possible to see the lens on the photo, and in a report he'd submitted shortly after searching the house, he'd noted that he'd found the lens next to the boot and underneath some clothing, suggesting it could have been there for some time before the murders. This is supported by the fact that there weren't any fingerprints or blood on the lens. Yeah, how about, Detective, Sergeant, when you're directing the jury to look at something, how about you don't make it up? Allegedly. Point number 7. David's fingerprints on the rifle. During the first trial, David had admitted that the rifle was his and that he regularly used it to hunt rabbits and possums. He'd also explained that it was entirely possible that he hadn't cleaned the gun properly and that the bloody fingerprints were from an earlier hunting session. During the first trial, the Crown had insisted that the bloody fingerprints had been made that morning, but had also explained that the rest of the rifle had been wiped down and that there weren't any other fingerprints on the rifle. As part of their appeal process, the defense had the blood tested, and it turned out that the bloody fingerprints consisted of animal blood, supporting David's claim that it was old blood. Well, there we have it. It was crazy they didn't test this the first time. I guess it was 1994, so it's a little more backwards back then. But I mean, they definitely had the ability to identify animal blood from human blood, because that's been around for a lot longer than DNA. So why didn't you do that the first time? Because to the jury, and I think I even made the comment, it'd be like, oh yeah, come on, please. But then it's like, no, it is animal blood. You're like, oh, well, that's unlikely, but there we go. Proof! Done! Great! Point number 8. Laniette's gurgling. During the first trial, the Crown explained that the killer had shot Laniette 3 times. Their experts then told the jury that the first bullet had entered beneath Laniette's left cheek and had only knocked her out. It had also resulted in blood pooling in her lungs, and because she was still breathing, this would have resulted in a gurgling sound. The second and third shots had entered her brain, resulting in her dying almost instantly, and so the Crown theorized that only Laniette's killer could have heard the gurgle. But during the second trial, the defense argued that it isn't unusual for bodies to make a gurgling sound after the person has passed away. It was just a result of trapped air leaving the body. And here, I can actually say that in my opinion, the defense's claims are incorrect. Though I don't have any experience of this occurring in a human body, I did grow up on a farm, and whenever we'd slaughter an animal, I'd help to dress down the carcass and process the meat. God damn. It's like, I know it feels so like hypocritical, or like, is that the right word? Where it's like, yeah, no, I love eating meat, but it's like, oh, gross to like strip down a carcass. And would I do it? Yes. Would I want to do it? No. As such, I know that it's not unusual for an animal to fart or make a gurgling sound after they'd died and their bodies were mostly intact, though this was often a result of us moving the animal's body. As such, I think that the defense's statement here is a little misleading, and I'm not the only one, since a Professor Ferris and Dr. Thompson testified on behalf of the Crown and explained that post-mortem gurgling was the result of the body being moved, not something that would occur naturally, unlike post-mortem farting, which occurs when the body starts to decompose. The defense also, it's good to know that there's something that will continue after my death. I'll continue to fart. The defense also wasn't able to find any experts who agreed that it was possible that Laniet had still been gurgling after the second and third shots to the skull. And lastly, we have point number 9, the motive. During the first trial, the Crown had speculated that David had murdered his family for financial gain and explained that despite the dilapidated state of 65 Every Street, Robin Bane hadn't been a pauper. In fact, he'd owned several properties that provided the family with additional income. After the family had dissolved all their assets, the Bane estate was worth around $600,000. That's got to be well over $1 million today, right? So that's not insignificant money. The court argued that David had known that Margaret and Robin were planning on getting a divorce, which would have meant that all the properties would have been sold and the proceeds split down the middle. To ensure that he would still inherit the full amount, he had to get rid of his entire family. The defense, however, had their own argument as for why Robin was the killer, but they hadn't been allowed to voice it during the first trial since the judge had dismissed their evidence and refused to have it presented to the jury. You see, the defense had wanted to argue that Robin had been having an incestuous relationship with his youngest daughter, Laniet, and that she threatened to tell the family. Their witness, Dean Cottle, had been a friend of Laniet's and had explained that she had been afraid her parents would find out that she was a sex worker. In turn, he'd blackmailed her for sex, leading to many referring to him as her pimp. Because of his lack of credibility, the judge had ruled his testimony was hearsay and that he wasn't a reliable witness. In his statement that was taken on the 24th of June 1994, Dean had explained that, quote, "I first met Laniet about 10 months ago in a bar in Dundon. We got to talking and got on well. After that meeting, we got to know each other and became friends. Laniet would talk to me sometimes and I would take her out for dinner. She did tell that she had been a sex worker at some stage. She told me that her father had been having sex with her and this had been happening for years, but he was still doing this as I believed it. I decided on Friday, 17th of June, to give her a call and see what she was up to. Later that day, I was driving through town and saw Laniet coming out of a coffee shop. It was in the afternoon. I stopped and spoke to her on the footpath for about 5-10 minutes. She told me that she was going to make a new start of everything and that her parents had been questioning everything about what she was doing. She said she was going to tell them everything and make a clean start of things." The quote ends. This gives the impression that she might have just wanted to confess to having been a sex worker, but several witnesses have come forward since the first trial who all remembered Laniet's claims that she and Robin regularly slept together. One was a shopkeeper who'd see Laniet whenever she visited his shop. During one of these trips, Laniet was crying, and when he asked her what was wrong, quote, she replied that there had been troubles at home. She was on drugs, and she was having an affair with her father. Bruh, that's not an affair. That is a crime, bro. A woman who'd run an escort agency explained that she'd befriended Laniet in 1993 and that the two of them had started working together. The two of them had been discussing their childhoods, and the woman told Laniet that she'd been sexually assaulted when she was 15. Laniet then told her that Robin had been molesting her for years and that it had all started when the family was still living in Papua New Guinea. Just a reminder, she had been 12 when they moved back to New Zealand. Fucking hell. Is this... The judge ruled this to be hearsay. Fucking hope the judge is right. A man named Sean Clark explained that he'd been friends with both Laniet and David. A month before the murders, he was waiting to meet up with David when Laniet showed up. The two of them talked, and Laniet told him that she was living with her dad in the schoolmaster's house at Thierry Beach School, but she wasn't happy there, and she was going to ask David to convince Margaret to allow her to move back into 65 Every Street. Quote, "I want to move back because I can't live with him anymore. I can't stand what he's doing to me any longer." But the Crown had witnesses who suggested that it wasn't the first time that Laniet had come up with a shocking story or two in return for sympathy and attention, and that these claims were obvious, deliberate lies. Her old PE teacher testified that a 15-year-old Laniet had once told him that she'd been sexually assaulted and then had an abortion while she was living in Papua New Guinea. Later, she explained that the baby had instead been given up for adoption. She also told him that she'd tried to kill herself once, but her sister, Arawa, had found her just in time and had saved her life. He hadn't prompted her into telling any of these stories. She'd just blurted them out one day as if she wanted to see how he'd react. After she told him about her attempt to kill herself, he'd made a point of studying her arms during class and noted that they didn't have any scars on them, leading him to wonder whether she had been telling the truth. The Crown essentially wrote her off as an attention seeker, and Detective Senior Sergeant Doyle even explained that they'd been aware of the accusations against Robin during their initial investigation, but they'd written them off because, quote, this was a homicide investigation, not an incest investigation. Or how about, when you come across some incest in your homicide investigation, you also investigate that, baby? Just a novel idea right there. Still, most of the new evidence presented by the defense at the second trial was just speculation, though it did punch a few holes in the Crown's version of events that day, and on the 5th of June 2009, the jury explained that the Crown had been unable to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that David Bain had murdered his family, and ruled that he was not guilty of all 5 charges against him. David Bain was acquitted, and he was free to go. Aftermath. In March 2010, David Bain applied to the Ministry of Justice for compensation, claiming that he'd been wrongly convicted back in 1995. In his affidavit, he explained that as a result, he'd suffered from clinical depression and PTSD, as he had been regularly assaulted by the other inmates. Yeah, I mean, this dude spent a long-ass time in prison. He needs some compensation. His family and most of his friends had abandoned him, and he was under intense media scrutiny. He was also finding it difficult to keep a job and had to rely on Joe Karam and his son for financial support. Quote, although I'm very grateful to be out of prison and to have been exonerated, I feel as though I have had over 15 years as a form of imprisonment. I have not been able to advance my life. I have only lived through the goodwill of others. His application sparked another round of debates regarding whether or not he deserved to be compensated. After all, despite Joe Karam's support and his insistence that David was innocent, many people still believe that David killed his family. Doesn't matter. He is innocent in the eyes of the law, and he needs some compensation because he was imprisoned innocently for a long-ass time. Justice Minister Simon Power appointed a Canadian judge to review David's case in an attempt to ensure that it would be as independent and unbiased as possible. He was Justice Ian Binney, a retired Canadian Supreme Court justice, and he spent an entire year interviewing various people and reading up on David's case. He even met with David in person and explained that in his opinion, David was a credible witness despite the inconsistencies in his various testimonies over the years. Justice Ian Binney submitted a 195-page long recommendation in September 2012 and explained that, I believe the physical evidence compels the conclusion that it is more probable than not that Margaret and 3 of the Bain children were killed by Robin Bane before he killed himself. In my view, setting aside the more exotic theories of the case, the Crown's theory is not consistent with the physical evidence collected by the police on the 20th of June. It is more likely than not that the murders were committed while David Bain was out of the house on his paper route. It is my recommendation that David Bain receive compensation for the wrongful 1995 conviction and the consequential 13 years in jail. Although his factual innocence has not been established beyond a reasonable doubt, I conclude that it is more likely than not that David Bain is factually innocent according to the lower civil standard of balance of probabilities. Yeah, I mean, that's what we got to go for here. And, his factual innocence has not been established beyond a reasonable doubt. Yeah, establishing innocence beyond a reasonable doubt, really challenging. That's why you have to establish guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. So he's innocent in the eyes of the law, and I think civilly, he's also now entitled to compensation, and I think this judge agrees with me, right? Now, I read through the entire report. God damn, 195 pages ever? Okay, thank you. And learned that Justice Binney seems to have based his opinion on 4 pieces of evidence: the bloodied footprints in the hallway, David's blood-spattered socks, the lack of blood in the shoes that David had been wearing on his delivery run, and the time when Robin would usually get up in the mornings. During their interview in July 2012, David had insisted that the clothes he'd been wearing when the police entered the house were the same clothes that he'd been wearing all morning, so Justice Binney ignored the Crown's theory that David had taken off his bloodied clothes after murdering his family and explained that David would have to go on the delivery route while still covered in his family's blood. In Justice Binney's opinion, this would have resulted in the blood on David's socks transferring to the insides of his shoes. Since the police didn't find any traces of blood on or inside the shoes, Justice Binney accepted that David couldn't have murdered his family before going on the newspaper route. His second argument is that it doesn't make sense to him that David would have risked Robin discovering the bodies before he got back from his newspaper run. In his mind, quote, such a mindless 4-before, 1-after plan attributed to David, a university student, is just not credible in the absence of any expert evidence that David suffered from an abnormality of the mind or possessed subnormal intelligence. No, this is the thing. I remember right back at the beginning, or, closer to the start of this episode, we were talking about he was assessed whether he's competent to stand trial. And it's yeah, he is. He's a guy who seems to know what he's doing. He's a university student, so he's obviously not dim. In my opinion, Inbini's report is very thorough and detailed, but he relied a bit too much on David's version of events as told during their meeting, especially considering that if he was guilty of murdering his family, David had years to work a good story out and fill in any holes. I mean, yes, sure, but filling in the holes is really tricky when you don't have someone else to poke those holes. Like, you could try and come up with them yourself, but then you get into it's like a debate. And you can try and think of all the arguments that the other side are going to come up with, and you will come up with many, but you were unlikely to come up with them all, and so you need to be good at thinking on the fly. And so here I'm like, I don't know. I don't find that quite so bad. Judith Collins, who was the new Justice Minister at the time, also didn't agree with Justice Binney's conclusions and commissioned a new review of David's case, this time by a retired Australian judge named Ian Callanan. This dude, you just spent a year writing these things. Like, what the f***? I put a lot of effort into that. Don't you like my credentials? I used to be on the Supreme fucking Court. His report is also very thorough and contains even more details regarding the witness statements as well as his own opinions as a judge. Though it isn't as well presented or as impressive as Judge Binney's, it is in my opinion very fair and takes every piece of evidence into account instead of outright dismissing them because they don't match his impression of what happened that morning. Instead, he separated the fluff from the facts and based his opinion on the following. 1. Neither the Crown nor the defense could prove whether the shot that killed Robin Bane was made by a contact or near-contact shot. 2. There were too many inconsistencies with regards to the measurements of the footprints in the hallway. Furthermore, he theorizes that it is more likely that the footprints in the hallway were old ones, and I agree since based on all the photos of the scene, there wasn't really enough puddled blood in Stephen's room to account for the amount of blood that would have been needed to make those footprints. 3. David's injuries immediately following the murders are too suspect, and the defense wasn't able to explain how he got them. 4. By all accounts, Robin Bane was described as being a walking skeleton, so it doesn't make sense that he would be able to fight and overpower Stephen. 5. Despite the defense claims that the lens could have been in Stephen's room for some time before the murders, it doesn't explain why a bent frame that was missing the left lens was found in David's room immediately following the murders. 6. David's so-called trance and recovered memories are too convenient, since it could be argued that he tried to use them to explain away the condemning evidence that the police had against him. This was an obvious attempt at claiming non-insane automatism, which according to the Oxford reference is unconscious involuntary conduct caused by some external factor where there is no claim of insanity. A person is not criminally liable for their acts carried out in a state of non-insane automatism, since his contact is altogether involuntary. Judge Callanan further goes on to explain that according to the 1960 Queensland case of Cooper and McKenna, blackout was one of the first refuges of a guilty conscience and a popular excuse. Yes, but that doesn't mean it's a valid defense. It's an invalid defense. Number 7. Although David reportedly was of good character and had been frank and relatively honest with the police during his discussions with them, innocent or not, everything he'd said from the moment he called 111 to his acquittal had to be taken with a grain of salt, since he admitted to his girlfriend that he was trying everything in his power to convince the police that he wasn't the one who committed those murders. I mean, yeah, but also of course he's going to be trying to convince the police that he didn't commit the murders, if he's innocent or guilty. 8. Furthermore, if Robin Bane had murdered his family because Laniert had accused him of incest, why would he spare David? David himself admitted that he and his father had a strained relationship. David even told the police that he'd wanted his father out of the house and that they often argued. And if Robin had indeed thought that David was the only one who deserved to stay, why would Robin try to frame David by using his rifle, wearing David's white opera gloves, changing out of his own clothes, and wiping the rifle down before he killed himself? Yeah. I don't think so. This really turns me around a little bit, because I think, is there enough evidence so he's criminally liable beyond all reasonable doubt? No, completely agree. He should not be in prison. However, balance of probabilities, did he do that? Kind of vibing that maybe, yeah, in my opinion. Judge Callanan submitted his 145-page long report in December 2015 and simply concluded that the applicant has not proved on the balance of probabilities that he did not kill his siblings and his parents on the morning of the 20th of June 1994. On the basis of Ian Callanan's report, the ministry rejected David Bain's claim for compensation but agreed to pay him an ex gratia amount of $925,000, which means that they're not saying he'd been a victim of wrongful conviction, but they just wanted him to shut up and go away. They'd also decided not to charge him with any further crimes relating to his family's death and decided just to let it go. Ever since then, there have been two distinct camps in the saga: those who believe that David Bain was responsible for the deaths of his family and shouldn't have been acquitted, and those who believe that his conviction was the result of police railroading and incompetence, which is why the murder of the Bain family is still, quote, the most widely discussed and divisive in New Zealand's criminal history. None of the sources I'd read during my research could agree on more than one point, and apart from the reports by the Privy Council, Ian Binney and Ian Callanan, all of them were either firmly in David's camp or firmly in the Crown's. At least all of the true crime YouTube channels I'd watched on the case all agree on one thing: that David Bain is allegedly still the most likely suspect. I don't know. Kind of think that Robin might be. I see something. Maybe Robin. It may be Robin, but maybe David's. I don't know. Yeah, maybe David's more likely. Allegedly, in my opinion. Dismembered appendices. If you want to watch another video on the Bain Family Murders, I'd recommend you watch Matt Orchard Crime and Society's video on the case, The Only One Who Deserved to Stay, the case of David Bain. The first 6 minutes of the video has absolutely nothing to do with the case, but since Matt provides a hilarious inside look at Kiwi culture, it's definitely entertaining. Number 2. Matt Orchard also explains that if David Bain's attempts at an appeal had failed, he'd still be a free man by 2011 since, quote, New Zealand's justice system has less of an emphasis on punishment than other countries, and we don't do consecutive sentences, so you don't see those Holtz Claw-esque centuries-long prison terms. A minimum non-parole period is just that, a minimum. So once his 16 years were up, if he was still deemed a danger, he could be kept inside, and there's no maximum for how long they could extend his prison stay, though in Bain's case, he likely would have gotten out around the same time his term was up due to how controversial the case was. Lifers who get parole are also on probation till the day they die. Sounds fair. It's kind of like a Nordic way of doing things. I think some people are so horrific that the key should be thrown away. And I mean, this leaves space for that, because it's like, well, yeah, if they're still a danger to society, like they've done some like mass shooting or some shit, then they'll be like, yeah, we never know. Keep them in prison. According to Matt, the only exception is the Christchurch mosque shooter, who will never see the light of day again. Yeah, exactly. God, that was a horrible mass shooting. Oh, I remember that. And it was streamed or something. Fucking horrific, wasn't it? That guy, yeah, he's that exception. Where it's like, yeah, it'd always be a danger to society, so throw away the fucking key. Number 3. The total cost of the Crown's case against David Bain, including the ex gratia payment, cost New Zealand taxpayers almost $8.5 million. His retrial alone cost more than $4 million and is noted as being the most expensive trial in New Zealand history. And those figures, for contemporary figures, like that's a lot more today. Oh, not a lot more, but a chunk more. Number 4. Joe Karam financially crippled himself during his fight for David's freedom. It's estimated that he lost approximately $4 million. He also divorced his wife, sold off most of his properties, and lost several of his businesses because he was spending so much time working the case, not to mention the 8 defamation cases that he fought in defense of his own statements and others' claims that David Bain was guilty of killing his entire family, which included one police officer's claim that Karam liked to caramelize the facts surrounding David's case to fit his own version of events. Damn, son, I assume that Joe Karam was just minted and that he's like retired and just like, yeah, I got money. I'm just going to take this as a personal cause. But he really went far, goddamn. 5. Following David's second murder trial, the jury came under a lot of scrutiny because they were considered to have been too sympathetic towards the kind, soft-spoken and polite David. It celebrated his birthday during the trial, and some of the jury members planned on sending him a gift. No! After the verdict was read out, some of them went up to hug and congratulate him, and afterwards, 2 members of the jury showed up at the celebration party that Joe Karam and David's other supporters held for them. That should not be allowed. I don't know how you're going to prevent that, but that should not be allowed. Number 6. David Bain has since moved on with his life. After his acquittal, he went on a 3-month trip to Europe that was sponsored by his supporters, though he still owed legal aid $30,000 for the services provided during his first trial. After he received the ex gratia payment, he married the daughter of one of his supporters, managed to find a job, changed his name, and now a father of 2, both of which are named after Stephen and Arawa. However, any further mention of him or his children online still includes a summary of what happened to his family, which is going to be a nightmare to navigate once his kids are old enough to Google their own names. Yeah, that's unfortunate. And that's where we end today's episode. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or a rating wherever you listen. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.